Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Way Forward Workshop Leader Lunch Break. And today we are featuring the incredibly well-dressed Darren Hamm. Darren has worked in every aspect of the nonprofit sector as volunteer, intern, staff, manager, and director. He holds a Master's of Nonprofit Management from CASE. This makes him exceptionally well-suited in his role as an instructor of nonprofit management and leadership at Oberlin College. However, his true calling is his service as director of the Cleveland office of the United States Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. He previously led refugee response and served on the leadership committee of the Refugee Services Collaborative. He has written about his work and his tireless efforts to forge collaborative partnerships. He's been featured on ABC News, NBC News, Omnivision, Univision, in Newsweek, and Huffington Post. At the core of his work, he believes in the power of collaborations to address systemic issues. He and his wife, Joanna, have long been involved as activists in improving Cleveland neighborhoods. And if that isn't enough, he's also an artist, both visual and a performing musician, and you can see his work and performances throughout Northeast Ohio. To enlighten us on providing homes and hope to refugees and immigrants, we welcome Darren Hamm.
Well, that was great, Marianne. I did not expect all of that. And I am suspicious about where you got some of those notes, but I will proceed. I would like to add, though, I was a 2006 intern at the Cleveland Leadership Center, which started my nonprofit career. So that was not in there. I'm going to share screen, folks. This is going to be best if we look at a few slides and then have a conversation. So I will open up there. I'm hoping you will be able to see my screen and the right one. All right. Does that look good, everybody? Rachel, good. So as Marianne had mentioned, I am Darren Hamm. I'm the director of the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. I'm going to walk you through big picture down to small picture and then invite some conversation about Northeast Ohio, what we're currently seeing in the world, as I know many of you are probably considering right now as we start this talk. So this office and this institution has been around for over 100 years in Northeast Ohio. USCRI has been nationally. The International Services Center, which I'll point to in a minute, has been in this community for since 1916, serving the needs of immigrants and refugees. The USCRI network is one that has 7 field offices and more than 30 affiliates across the whole country. So we're a pretty broad away. We deal with migrant and border issues, many humanitarian crises, both domestically and internationally, and here have the strongest face around refugee resettlement. We are one of 9 agencies in the country. So when you think about where we fit and what happens with refugees in the world, there are 9 voluntary agencies. We fit within there as one of the 9. You see many faith communities leading these institutions across the country. In Cleveland, Ohio, we have 3 primary agencies. Those are led by the Catholic bishops, HIAS International, or HIAS, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which is us together, and the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. We are part of a very strong collaborative network, of which we have some partners on today, Mr. Simperman, as well as others, that really seek to provide a full wraparound of support services in a very unique collaborative way in Northeast Ohio. So we're thinking about the immediacy of people arriving, the secondary and tertiary needs of those individuals as they grow to succeed in Northeast Ohio. So we're everyone from healthcare, schools, and major institutions around our region that collectively get together and think about those needs across a spectrum of people. Let's talk about USCRI Cleveland very quickly. As I mentioned, we are an old institution in this city. We largely were developed to facilitate resettlement efforts for immigrants and refugees in the very early part of the century, largely from Eastern and Southern Europe. So if you came from many of those nations, you came through our doors. We were one of the standalone immigrant service centers. That evolved into the 50s to the Nationality Services Center, where it remained for the next 40 years. Most commonly and most contemporarily, you would have known this as the International Services Center until 2016, where it was adopted by U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. I'm going to do a quick Refugee 101. This is where most people like to hear, who are these folks? Where are they? What's the process? So I'll touch very briefly on the big stuff, and we could get into more details as we talk in the next half hour. Currently, this number is wrong. We have added in the past week and a half, we've added 2 million people to this total of displaced persons. That does not account for folks outside of Ukraine currently that are moving from other peripheral areas. But before the crisis we're facing currently in Ukraine, we had 82 million people on the move, displaced from their native homelands. This equates, at least in the United States, and when we think of this in a global context, 1 out of less than every 100 people have fled their homelands and are currently in a state of transition. They are not all immediately declared refugees. They face various different statuses and pursuits of statuses in different countries, which we can get into shortly. If you think about that entire world population, these are the very, very quickest facts we can kind of assemble on them. I will point specifically to most people are displaced within their country, but remain in that country as an internally displaced person. Once they cross that international boundary and become recognized by an entity like the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, they officially are sanctioned as a refugee in that third country. We have moved over the 50% mark for those who are aged 18 over. That just happened this week. And I will state a fact that several surprising facts. Most people do not live in camp environments. So when we close our eyes and we think about refugees, we picture a refugee camp because I think the way we see it contemporarily in the media. However, many live in an urban setting with only very remedial supports. Most people spend an average of 10 to 15 years in the refugee resettlement process. This is not something where you cross a border, get on a plane, and go to a third country. This is a very delineated, very structured process that has thorough vetting, health screenings, and matching that has to go on in order to fully support an individual that leaves their country. Only 1% of those who leave will ever be resettled. Most will never return to their homeland. They'll live in this kind of limbo state for the rest of their lives. I wanted to show kind of a diversity of place. There's people who live in rural and urban environments. People live in transitional camps, very temporary structures. You've probably seen from last fall when folks were fleeing Afghanistan that there were camps set up on US military bases that looked like everything from huge gymnasiums to plastic tarps. The experience varies greatly across the world. I will only glance at this. This is an entire lunch and learn session in its own right, the vetting process and the procedural steps that one must go through in order to become a refugee. So they go through not only reaching that safe haven, which is the #1 underrated element here in this picture, by reaching a place and being registered, then starts this process, which goes through, as I said, a thorough screening and vetting before there's any travel to a third country, especially the United States. When we think about where people are at, these are where refugees are coming from. These are where people are becoming displaced. I use a secondary graphic when I think about people. This is how people move across time over the past several years. So this gives you, I think, a little more dynamic picture of these dots are people, and you can see where migrations are happening from and going to. So the orange is the origination spot, the red is where they end up, and they're transitioning between two places. And you can see in some of these bursts, they're remaining roughly in their same regions, but exiting their homeland. Let's talk about Northeast Ohio and what that means here, as we've been doing this work for some time, and most recently in a large wave of new arrivals. So Cleveland, as many can attest, is not a place we have to start a conversation defending the value of immigrants and refugees. I use this snapshot because if we went backwards exactly 100 years, this city was roughly 50% immigrant and refugee. So these were people that fled for various economic conditions and hardships in other places. These denote very different communities and the way they looked in Cleveland's earlier settlement. We today are somewhere around the 4 to 6% mark when it comes to immigrants and refugees. I snapshotted for you what it looks like in the past 4 years prior to my tenure here of where people have been resettled in Northeast Ohio. So you can see largely we followed patterns that have been established over the past, well, I would say largely 50 to 60 years, but more so in the past 10 years of people settling west of the Cuyahoga River and only in very pocketed ways east of the Cuyahoga. We can have a conversation about that as well. Refugee resettlement in Cleveland has varied over time. When we think about it in the national context, there's been a commitment for the past 20 years to bring in at least 100,000 to 125,000 people. That changed in 2016 with the presidential administration that basically shut down this operation and put in a number of barriers that would keep people from entering through the refugee process. So you could see the curve going downwards as we looked at the last 4 years. And then a very big spike following the flight of persons from Afghanistan after the collapse of Kabul in August of 21. We received more in several weeks than we did in an entire year in the months of October, November, and December, supporting those who were coming from Afghanistan. A snapshot of who we have here. This is very big and broad, but these are people who we currently have in the pipeline, people who we've received in this past year, and people who we will respect, nations of origin will expect to receive in the next 6 to 12 months. You can also see, as noted on there, Afghanistan, which has been our primary source of resettlement over the past 6 months, and Ukraine, who we already have people in the pipeline who will be arriving to our offices. The US system is really set up with the design of people becoming self-sufficient within 4 to 6 months. If you looked north to Canada, the system is designed entirely different, where if you were going to come as a refugee, you were matched with a family who's going to support you for the next year. They'll help you with transportation, program enrollments, school enrollments, health screenings, access to grocery stores and faith-based communities. Here, you come in, you get $1,000, you get connected with your very first housing opportunity and your first employment opportunity, and you're expected to be moving along within that 6-month time frame and beyond. I will say, as crazy as that design is, and with as many problems as there is, folks are extremely resilient and very successful if you just glance at the big, broad numbers, right? 3/4 are employed, as opposed to 60% of folks who would be here already. So 75% are employed, and less than 8% currently depend upon public assistance. Those primarily being assistance for long-term physical disabilities, or other issues. Overwhelmingly, people come in as they have for hundreds of years, gain employment, and succeed. They come in with very different statuses to this country. People live in transition generally for that first period of 5 years, whereby they can obtain their US citizenship. We currently are serving most highly humanitarian parolees, those who came from Afghanistan, as well as mainstay, which is refugees and asylees. I'll talk just quickly upon Afghanistan. I believe most will probably want to discuss Ukraine, so we'll have answers about that too. As we saw most recently, the refugee resettlement industry was probably put under its greatest amount of pressure in its history over the past 6 months. We were down to very few staff, very little funding, and we received 80,000 people at one time that fled Afghanistan. So in Northeast Ohio, we took in about 600. We had 100 cases, about 330 of those, so about half of the people who arrived to Northeast Ohio. They were granted basically a temporary permission slip to be here. A humanitarian parolee is not a status, it's a designation that allows them to stay for 24 months. They then have to find a route to become a permanent citizen or to return home, most of whom will stay here and become either asylees, refugees, obtain a special immigrant visa if they worked on behalf of the federal government, or find another path to remain or to transition to another place. And I have some of these here. We won't go through the details. These are different immigration statuses and how they affect folks. I can come back to this if there's questions. And mainly, our pointers here as we talk through Afghan parolees is we really need to honor, I think, what we've done in history through Gulf War and even the Vietnam War prior, is when a wave of people arrive, we need to grant them some sort of a long-term status here in order for them to be reasonably expected to succeed in our home, in our countries here. I'm going to give you a very quick glance at what we do, because it's not just the initial pick folks up at the airport, but that's what most people think. This is the immediacy of what happens when we get notified we're going to take in a family. So they could call us today, say next Thursday, XYZ families arriving at the airport, here's what we have to do. So housing is number one. It's always shelter, and then it's food, and then it's household goods, and then it's all the stuff that kind of layers in a very triaged way thereafter. This is mainly provided by our case management staff, but also in cooperation with a ton of community partnerships. The only way we can make these sort of things happen with a limited amount of resources. They are provided and we're provided. I always ask everybody to remember, if you're handed $1,000 entering this country, can you imagine getting an apartment with a security deposit, first month's rent, groceries, clothing, which you did not have when you fled, and other very, very immediate supports. So you can imagine how much we have to leverage to support a family. We do a lot of other stuff too. So it starts there and then it grows into other places. Places like employment services, short and long-term, healthcare, behavioral health integrations, and a number of different community services. We also have 70 employees in a language bank that we run interpretation and translation services for every language right now you can imagine in demand in places like the legal system, hospitals, and schools. So, and we offer plenty of ways for the community to get involved. Normally today, that looks like people wanting to donate things that we keep on our wish list that's regularly updated for the immediate needs of families. And some want a deeper dive. They want to come in and do what I'll call is like an adopt a family, but through community sponsorship, where they're matched with an individual or a family, and they grow with them across time. You know, they help meet the needs of that family and help them succeed in this community. So I will leave out this information, this info at USCRIOhio.org. I will share this obviously so that it can be posted and shared and referenced for future, for any of the attendees here, but then end here and let you guys ask questions.
Great, Darren, thank you so much. Let's kind of talk through the partnerships. So you mentioned that there's a lot of partners that have to come into play to help folks get settled. Who are some of those key partners, and what are some of those best practices to make sure that those partnerships kind of work successfully?
Yeah, so some like here today, like Joe's here from Global Cleveland. We have other partners at like Cleveland Municipal School District, where people might be housed in Cleveland and have their first apartments in Cleveland. We'll have the hospital systems. We'll have medical clinics. Well, boy, you can think of every need of a person, and we've built our partnerships around that. That can flow all the way down into, like I mentioned, behavioral health, domestic violence, addiction and drug treatment facilities. And what we want to do is basically move the whole mountain at the same time, keep everybody attuned to the needs of those individuals who are arriving, what communities they come from, keeping them culturally informed and literate about how those services could be rendered to new communities in real time, and then having them on the ready. So when one family faces one issue, we can make those connections immediately and not have to start over from square one. So it becomes a challenge, I think, for our agencies to stay keeping everybody moving at the same pace with the amount of demand that comes internally with just supporting families. But it is kind of making sure you consider, if you took the impression of one person and all the needs they might have, thinking about all those and going around and kind of recruiting your partners as you move.
You shared some statistics around employment and public assistance. Do the national statistics mirror the statistics that you shared?
Broadly, yes. So that was a report that was commissioned several years ago by the Refugee Services Collaborative that I nodded to early in the presentation. That was primarily Northeast Ohio, but as we work with our peers across the state, they are at, and sometimes even exceeding, depending on the market. Some of the major cities do exceed those numbers because of employment opportunities. And again, those numbers ebb and flow. So if we were having this presentation 10 years ago, I would have said employment opportunities were a lot harder, but housing opportunities were prevalent. We've now kind of flipped that equation where we have a 93% rental rate in the city of Cleveland, so occupancy rate of rental units. So we have limited housing opportunities, but we have tremendous economic opportunities through employment currently with the amount of demand. So.
And of course, you mentioned that with the current conflict in Ukraine, the 2 million refugees that have fled. Can you share more about what we're seeing? We see so much on the news and hear so many stories. What is the impact of 2 million refugees leaving their country, and how might that look from a support standpoint in the countries they're moving to and the United States?
Yeah, I think the most recent reporting shows places like Poland doing pretty well in receiving folks at the border. And so I'll talk from a very distant land, working in a process that's very long term and would take years for people to get through, kind of our normal flow of things, unless there's a kind of a special program that's introduced at the by the administration. So there's some challenges in kind of how we picture the immediate response we can have to what's happening in Ukraine, because we have people moving. Those are people who have cases pending in the refugee resettlement process. We don't know where they're at. They have fled. We need to re-identify kind of who they are, where they are, if they're safe, and where they're at in process now. Once they've reached these places, people who've either fled and are now trying to become refugees, or with the hopes of even returning home, they're becoming registered. They're getting very immediate supports around shelter and food. Beyond that, some people are putting up fences. You've seen some news probably coming out of England around the opportunity for people to obtain visas and move and obtain even temporary residence in England, and others who are opening the gates and moving people around and allowing them even in a transitional mode, some remedial supports. I think when we look at our relationship to what's happening there, we know that even if a process will be quick, it would still be a couple of years to find somebody coming through the normal flow of a refugee resettlement to the United States. What will happen, and what we anticipate happening, is that there'll be some privatized efforts to bring over immediate family members and maybe other people of relations by sponsoring things like visa applications, airfare, and then the immediate supports when they arrive of housing and other household needs. And that would be done, we've had many conversations in the past week and a half about how to make that happen in a private way, because the federal way takes long, and it's challenging, and there's it's not timely in response to a crisis.
So, and as we look at Northeast Ohio, what are the agencies that help with immigration issues and status?
You have a couple different networks. So within our refugee resettlement network, places like Catholic Charities Migration and Refugee Services has a legal services department that really addresses all sorts of different legal immigration needs. We're establishing our own services as well in partnership with Catholic Charities. Building Hope in the City also has an attorney on staff. There were services from Asian Services in Action. There's private market or even pro bono support. So there's certain things that places like Legal Aid Society can provide around immigration supports. And then there's plenty of attorneys who have been kind of supportive rings around some of the work, specifically about refugees. There's other immigration supports that are built out in other networks that we don't necessarily interface with regularly, but that have either voluntary pro bono or low cost attorneys available for what are very often complicated and very long-term processes. I'll point at something like an Afghan client coming in who has a special immigrant visa. That process generally is about 19 steps in procedure and about 3 years long. The same goes for things like an asylee application, where if you reach a new country and you claim asylum, there's a 90% failure rate for those applications unless you have paid representation. So we need to build out those services and systems in order to better support people who want to be here and who will succeed here if they have that sort of status.
Does your organization serve as the primary support for families in helping them to really acclimate to life in the United States and then Northeast Ohio? Or do you have volunteers and families in the area that serve as hosts or mentors?
Both. I would love to think we could do everything that's needed, but there's no way. Absolutely not in the most qualified way can you really give everybody what they need. What you can do is structure it in a way that you're providing kind of the high points and hoping that between the community you help connect them to, both their native community, if it's say like folks from Afghanistan and Afghans who've been here since 2002, making those kind of connections so that they could lean on one another in a way that immigrants have always done when they reach a new land, or connect them with native community members who will help kind of usher in an understanding of systems and process that we don't have necessarily the time in a rush of people to provide a really good training on, to really acclimate them to the new environment and how to function best within the society. Some of that's going to come over time. We worry really most about that 0 to 90 day period. And then as we go through some of our other programs that generally extend to about the 2-year mark, At that point, there's kind of a fall off, and we really rely on community partners like the Refugee Response, Global Cleveland, Building Hope in the City, Asian Services in Action, to really provide kind of that wraparound support to keep them moving forward and growing in Northeast Ohio.
And once they're settled here, do refugees tend to stay? And if so, are family members then joining them at some point?
Very, very largely they stay. We have a low rate of out-migration. What we've seen in the most recent wave is a lot of people wanting to come here after being resettled to the States in the most recent term, last 6 months. So in-migration is a great opportunity for us. I think something we always want to attract so long as our supports are there and our infrastructure is built in a way that doesn't look like it did in the past 4 years. Like we have staff, we have systems, we have resources to provide them. I think we always want to use that as an opportunity to this region. I think maybe Mr. Simperman can even speak to that and kind of how that values our region economically, as well as I think in the fabric of our communities. We do provide as much assistance as we can to attract that. We always see that when folks land, the number one thing they want is to make sure they're safe and secure and have their most immediate needs met. The next question is, how do I bring my family? And we have to provide good mechanisms without really strong legal supports and without many legal avenues to do that with folks like they've come from Afghanistan. That's a very complicated factor to try and communicate with new community members. And I think that's some of the advocacy work we have to do on our side to better prepare for different groups of people in different time.
And through your work and seeing what's happening across the world, what are some of the other issues that are on your radar that we should be aware of or that we might not be hearing about yet?
We watch pretty regularly at the national level and even at the local level. You know, we try and stay attuned to where all of the fires that are going on around the world, and those are primarily hostile situations, right? In civil wars, places where we've had histories of displaced persons or ethnic atrocities. We watch them emerge. We watch them get quiet, even though they might not be in the media, but we watch them kind of sustain across time from different pockets of the world. I think when I showed you that heat map, you kind of know where those hotspots have primarily been and will be, at least for the short term. I think what's on my radar is environmental refugees, those who will come at the hands of a climate crisis that we have not really prepared for internationally. I think we're starting to make some of those acknowledgements. And then there's also work that has to be done on migrating populations being designated and being honored as refugees because they're fleeing for very specific reasons, similar to other groups across the world. So when we see folks from Central and South America, I think we need to kind of continuously watch that and change the tone of that conversation about why people are showing up and how we can better support them in systems that are really well established. I regularly talk about refugee resettlement as being the antidote to illegal immigration. There's a very heated rhetoric around the way people arrive, who they are, the perception of employment opportunities being taken from Native persons. But I think when we really look at refugee resettlement, this thoroughly vetted, really long process that in a high quality way connects people to a new community and grows them in a place, it's the perfect solution to what I think is a very, again, a very challenging national dialogue around the value of immigrants.
We have time for one more question. So what do you most need from those of us who are on the call today?
To attend calls like today, which is great, number one. So congratulations to all of you. It's wonderful to not know we start from scratch in so many ways in this town, because we have a lot of people who love and believe in this work. We, of course, take kindness in any direction it comes. Financial contributions, donations of goods, donations of service and volunteerism. And I would say in some of our best case scenarios, being a community member who's willing to walk side by side with somebody they might not know, understand, have any relationship to is one of the most rewarding experiences I personally have found in my whole life. And I watch it light many other people up often. So we keep those avenues open. We take any way people can connect to us. We try and provide the most meaningful way to engage with these new community members as possible. So we can, if you write that info email, we'd gladly find a way for you to connect in the way that's meaningful to you. So.
Well, Darren, thank you so much. And we will be sure to include that email in the follow-up email to today's session. And we encourage everyone to please follow up with Darren. And we thank you for your time and sharing such great insights, especially as the refugee conversation is front and center daily on our news. So we appreciate you being here and sharing the information. And I'm going to turn it back to Marianne.
Thank you, Rachel. Darren, I'll echo Rachel's thanks. The work you do is truly heroic, and I'm sure that you have many sleepless nights and are on call 24/7. So on behalf of everyone on this call, thank you for all that you do to build our community.